Ben Shapiro asked Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez three distinct mathematical questions on live television, and the woman possessing 8.6 million followers, recognized universally as the face of the Green New Deal and the voice of an entire political generation, could not execute the basic arithmetic of her own flagship policy. A seventh-grade math teacher residing in the Bronx was watching the broadcast at home with a pencil in hand, and she proved more than capable of doing the calculations herself. The debate stage was intentionally devoid of the traditional trappings of a congressional hearing room. There was no sweeping marble, no grand display of flags, and no gallery of spectators arranged in ascending rows like an attentive jury. Instead, the arena consisted merely of two solitary podiums, a neutral moderator's desk situated squarely between them, and four high-definition cameras positioned intimately enough to catch the slightest blink of an eye. The illumination raining down from the rafters was classic flat and bright studio lighting, purposefully designed to be the kind that removes all forgiving shadows and forcefully pushes everything into the exact same harsh plane of visibility. This specific lighting setup is notoriously useful when the primary subject you want visible happens to be a face that has completely run out of answers. Far from those bright lights, in a quiet living room in the Bronx, a woman named Dorothy Chen methodically turned on her television set, placed a steaming cup of tea on the side table, and deliberately set a sharpened pencil alongside a fresh sheet of ruled paper directly on the arm of her comfortable chair. Dorothy was 61 years old, a seasoned veteran of the public education system, who had been actively teaching seventh-grade mathematics in a public school located squarely within AOC's own congressional district for an impressive 34 years. Over the course of those 34 years, she had meticulously developed a specific habit that her husband playfully characterized as obsessive, but which she firmly maintained was purely professional in nature. Whenever someone on the television screen stated a numerical figure, she immediately wrote it down, driven not by any underlying political motivation, but by a strict dedication to accuracy, firmly believing that numbers, unlike the deeply flawed human beings who actively use them, do not possess personal opinions. Just yesterday, an inquisitive student named Marcus had eagerly raised his hand during a standard classroom lesson regarding fractions and directly asked, "Chen, exactly how much does the Green New Deal cost?" Dorothy had regrettably not possessed an answer for the boy at that moment, but tonight she fully intended to discover one. When one of them explicitly says a number, I write it down, she casually informed her husband, who was quietly engrossed in reading a paperback novel in the adjacent room. "That is absolutely all I am doing here. Just the numbers," she clarified before drawing a stark vertical line straight down the center of her line page, writing Shapiro clearly on the left side and AOC deliberately on the right, and then she simply waited for the data to arrive. The central question of the evening was ostensibly simple as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez firmly stood at her designated podium, exuding the highly polished posture of a modern political figure who had meticulously learned across 1,000 live Instagram broadcasts and 100 intense cable news appearances exactly how to command and occupy a visual frame. She kept her shoulders drawn back, her chin slightly angled directly toward the camera lens, and her hands moving in practiced gestures that were carefully calibrated to be neither too excessively large nor too minimally small, but rather exactly the precise physical size that clearly reads as pure, unadulterated passion on a 65-inch screen. Do we want an economy that genuinely works for absolutely everyone? Or an economy that only works for the privileged people currently in this room? She asked before deploying a deliberately practiced pause. It was not a mechanical hesitation, but a highly trained cessation of speech, crafted in the exact same manner a professional singer's vibrato is rigorously trained, taking a fundamentally natural human action and purposefully shaping it into a totally reliable rhetorical weapon. The Green New Deal is fundamentally not a mere policy paper. It is a profound moral document, she declared, continuing by asserting that it boldly states that the absolute richest country on the face of the earth should be fully able to guarantee all of its citizens access to clean air, pure water, good-paying jobs, and a fully livable planet. She emphatically insisted that such a stance is not radically extreme, but is instead a fundamental promise, boldly proclaiming that if actively keeping that specific promise is widely considered radical, then she is immensely proud to be called radical. The subsequent applause from the audience was notably warm and quick, possessing the unmistakable acoustic quality of a gathered crowd that had been explicitly prepared beforehand to applaud on cue. Directly opposite her, Ben Shapiro stood quietly at his designated podium, outfitted in a dark suit that appeared slightly too large for his frame, and wearing a yarmulke that was securely held in its proper place with a simple bobby pin. His hands rested calmly at his sides, and his face actively carried the very particular, quietly intense patience of a man who has been deliberately waiting for an opponent to finally finish speaking a sentence that he fully intends to systematically disassemble. I genuinely appreciate the Congresswoman's obvious passion, and I sincerely want to start this exchange by actually agreeing with her. He began his speaking voice immediately establishing itself as incredibly fast, though notably not rushed, purely possessing the natural velocity of an individual whose brain continuously operates at a rapid speed that his physical mouth has spent 39 years desperately trying to match. He stated clearly that they definitely should talk about math tonight, agreeing that she was entirely right, that this entire debate is ultimately about numbers, and therefore formally proposing that they actually discuss those specific numbers. However, he prefaced his incoming inquiry by openly stating an honest assessment of his own position, reminding the room that he is absolutely not a sitting United States senator. He does not possess a heavy folder full of legal subpoenas, and he does not have the backing of a powerful congressional committee actively standing behind him. He purposefully gestured to the vast, empty television stage surrounding his podium and bluntly characterized himself as merely a guy standing there with a microphone, clarifying that all he truly brought with him tonight were direct questions, and he would very much like the sitting Congresswoman to actually answer them directly, specifically requesting that she refrain from responding with sweeping political speeches or soaring moral documents, but instead looking directly at her, demanding she respond with hard numbers. Congresswoman, exactly what does the Green New Deal cost? He asked, with piercing directness. Ocasio-Cortez immediately parried by stating that the Green New Deal is fundamentally a non-binding resolution. Shapiro swiftly interjected, confirming that he knew exactly what the document was, but aggressively reiterated his demand to know what it fundamentally costs to implement. The Congresswoman attempted to maneuver, explaining that the ultimate cost is entirely dependent upon the final scope of its implementation, which would theoretically be determined by subsequent legislative actions. Do you currently have a specific number? Shapiro pressed, his voice notably refusing to rise in volume, but noticeably accelerating in its intense tempo, asking if she possessed absolutely any number at all, perhaps a rough ballpark figure or a projected range, essentially begging for something concrete that a dedicated seventh-grade math teacher currently sitting in the Bronx could reasonably write down on a blank piece of paper in her quiet living room. Concurrently, Dorothy Chen's sharpened pencil hovered expectantly over the right-hand column of her page, the specific section she had clearly labeled AOC, as she patiently waited for a hard number to be spoken. The requested number entirely failed to materialize. In its glaring absence, Dorothy deliberately wrote a single question mark, rendering it incredibly small and impeccably neat, utilizing the highly disciplined handwriting of an experienced educator who has been painstakingly marking student papers for 34 straight years and absolutely refuses to waste precious ink. That became the very first stark question mark on the page. Ocasio-Cortez attempted to pivot by noting that the American Action Forum had previously estimated a staggering cost of $93 trillion, but she quickly dismissed that figure by claiming the estimate was deliberately and artificially inflated by a highly conservative think tank expressly designed to undermine her platform. Shapiro instantly seized the opening, leaning approximately an inch closer to his microphone, and demanded to know if she possessed her very own internal financial number. He reminded her aggressively that she was the one who had originally introduced this sweeping resolution, that she proudly stood as its primary legislative sponsor, and that she had essentially built the entirety of her soaring political career directly upon its foundation, yet she shockingly did not possess a single internal cost estimate, neither from her own official congressional office nor from any allied friendly think tank, absolutely nothing from anyone. AOC fired back, her voice suddenly finding a distinct edge, that very sharp, uniquely certain vocal edge she historically discovered whenever she was rapidly building toward a potent soundbite that was guaranteed to trend across social media for the next 2 days, loudly declaring that you simply do not price a conceptual framework, you exclusively price the specific legislation that is drafted to implement it, insisting that is exactly how standard governmental policy operates. Shapiro immediately shot back, asking if she possessed a concrete number for absolutely any piece of the underlying legislation that would actually implement the sweeping framework. A heavy silence instantly descended upon the studio, remaining only for a short half-second, but Shapiro masterfully caught that brief hesitation in the exact same instinctual manner. A highly skilled shortstop snags a blistering line drive, reacting purely on ingrained instinct long before the conscious brain even has sufficient time to actively tell the hands what to physically do. That brief silence is your ultimate answer, Congresswoman, he stated with brutal precision. He articulated that she was actively demanding that roughly 330 million American citizens fundamentally alter how they live their daily lives, including how they drive, how they heat their personal homes, how they consume food, and how they perform their daily work. Yet she had completely failed to produce even a single solitary cost estimate to justify the transition. He accused her of totally outsourcing the fundamental mathematics of her policy to the very same people she regularly dismisses as operating in bad faith, ultimately pointing out that she had simply not done her own underlying homework. Straightening his posture aggressively, Shapiro volunteered to do the necessary math for her on live television, loudly proposing a rapid-fire sequence of 3 definitive yes or no questions. 1. Should every single American citizen possess guaranteed access to health care, to which AOC affirmed yes? 2. Should every American have a federally guaranteed job, to which she again affirmed yes? 3. Should America successfully achieve net zero carbon emissions by the year 2050, yielding a final yes? Shapiro rapidly recited the corresponding financial data, noting that universal health care routinely costs approximately $3 trillion per year, a federal jobs guarantee program, highly dependent on the specific economic model chosen, runs anywhere between $500 billion and $2 trillion, and achieving net zero emissions, relying upon the lowest possible serious estimate, would demand between $5 and $10 trillion spread over 25 years. His vocal delivery was neither outwardly angry nor perceptibly smug. Rather, it was uniquely devoid of emotion, sounding exactly like the voice of a man dryly reading a grocery store receipt. He forcefully concluded that she had just publicly said yes to anywhere between $15 and $93 trillion in completely new federal spending, heavily criticizing her earlier excuse that you cannot price a conceptual framework by noting that he had just successfully priced it in a mere 30 seconds solely by utilizing her own direct answers. Back in the Bronx, Dorothy methodically inscribed the data on her paper. 3t plus 2t plus 5t equals 10t minimum, deliberately taking the extra moment to starkly underline the crucial word minimum. She then glanced thoughtfully at the right-hand column of her page, noting with disappointment that AOC's specific column remained entirely blank, still stubbornly holding nothing more than that initial lonely question mark. Frustrated by the absolute lack of data, Dorothy decisively turned the page over, forcefully writing at the very top of the fresh sheet, "Where is her number?" Ocasio-Cortez immediately attempted to reclaim the narrative, forcefully accusing Shapiro of possessing a cruel desire to artificially reduce the ongoing survival of the entire human species down to a mere budgetary line item. Her voice had noticeably climbed, not necessarily increasing in sheer acoustic volume, but definitely rising in rhetorical altitude, elevating in the distinct manner a human voice naturally climbs whenever the speaker is desperately reaching for a perceived moral high ground that they sincerely hope will somehow prove higher and more defensible than basic arithmetic. She passionately challenged him, asking if he truly wanted to slap a callous price tag on the looming threat of Miami completely going underwater, on the state of California burning to the ground in raging wildfires, or on the fundamental ability of the vulnerable children residing strictly within her district to simply breathe clean air. This is emphatically not a basic spreadsheet, Mr. Shapiro. This is a profound moral question. And the very fact that you stubbornly cannot see that inherent truth actively tells me far more about your fundamental worldview than absolutely any numerical figure you could ever possibly quote, she declared fiercely. The studio audience immediately responded to her emotional appeal, not with explosive applause, but with something significantly lower and more subtle, a gentle, rolling murmur of general agreement that smoothly moved throughout the spectator seats in the exact same gentle manner a light breeze subtly moves across an open field of grass, lightly touching absolutely everything in its path, while firmly committing to absolutely nothing concrete. Shapiro simply waited with iron discipline for the low murmur to completely die down. And then he proceeded with a strikingly unhurried demeanor, the absolute only unhurried action he had deliberately taken during the entire evening's proceedings. He readily conceded that it indeed was a moral question, but he rapidly pivoted to assert that the single most deeply moral action a representative government can ever take prior to actively asking its working citizens to pay for a massive program is to honestly tell those exact same citizens exactly what that program actually costs. He painted a vivid socioeconomic picture, pointing out that she was actively demanding a struggling waitress living in Queens who barely earns $35,000 a year to help blindly pay for a massive federal program that the Congresswoman fundamentally cannot even attach a rudimentary number to. He further emphasized the sheer injustice of asking a dedicated math teacher working in the Bronx and making a modest $58,000 a year to directly fund an incredibly expensive public policy whose underlying basic math, the policy's own author, had stubbornly refused to actually complete. He declared unequivocally that lawmakers absolutely do not get to simply skip the grueling math just because they believe their underlying cause is incredibly important, arguing that truly important causes explicitly require the rigorous math, precisely because the working people eventually paying the massive bill are decidedly not insulated billionaires. They are everyday teachers, waitresses, and bus drivers, and they inherently deserve the basic dignity of knowing exactly what their government is asking them to buy, long before they are forcefully asked to actually buy it. Sitting in her Bronx living room, Dorothy explicitly heard the specific words "math teacher" in the Bronx echo from the television, and her moving pencil abruptly stopped dead in its tracks. She fully knew that the conservative commentator obviously did not know her actual personal name, nor did he genuinely know that she specifically existed in reality, but she deeply felt that he was directly talking about her in that exact moment. She slowly looked down at her paper containing the two severely contrasting columns, sharply observing that Shapiro's specific side was rapidly filling up with hard numerical data, while AOC's corresponding side remained distressingly full of empty blanks. And in that fleeting moment, she profoundly understood a universal truth that she had inherently known for 34 years in the classroom, but had surprisingly never thought to directly apply to the realm of national politics. The specific person actively wielding the hard numbers is certainly not always factually right, but the individual showing up completely without them is always, without exception, entirely unprepared. Furthermore, being unprepared is absolutely not the exact same thing as being factually wrong. But in Dorothy's strict estimation, it is considerably worse because showing up completely unprepared clearly indicates that you blatantly didn't do the required homework. And within the rigorous confines of Dorothy's classroom, completely failing to do the assigned homework is the single solitary offense that she absolutely refuses to ever forgive. Simultaneously, deep backstage in a cramped dressing room illuminated by a harsh monitor and containing a cheap folding table completely buried beneath heavily vibrating mobile phones and massive stacks of dense briefing papers, AOC's lead communications advisor nervously watched the ongoing debate unfold with her arms tightly crossed across her chest. She had been frantically text messaging AOC's immediate support team for the past 6 torturous minutes, and the very last urgent text she had desperately sent, which predictably nobody had responded to, simply because there was absolutely nobody available to actually respond to it, given that the Congresswoman was actively trapped on live television and fundamentally could not check her personal device read with stark panic. She needs to stop answering yes/no. He's carefully building a cage. She helplessly watched Shapiro seamlessly transition to ask his next probing question. She watched her boss confidently begin to answer it, and overwhelmed with mounting dread, she forcefully pressed both of her damp palms firmly down against the folding table and practically whispered to nobody in the empty room, pivot immediately to emotional stories, stop actively engaging with him on the hard numbers. Unfortunately for the advisor, on the glowing monitor, Ocasio-Cortez was already actively attempting to answer the conservative commentator's next incoming question, prompting the stressed advisor to simply close her eyes in sheer defeat, realizing completely that her urgent advice was far too late to make a difference. Shapiro aggressively pressed forward, noting that the Congresswoman's highly touted Green New Deal explicitly includes a massive federal jobs guarantee, meaning every single American citizen who actively desires employment is supposedly guaranteed to receive one, to which he asked what logically happens if an individual successfully secures their federally guaranteed job but then proceeds to do objectively bad work. AOC quickly attempted to defuse the trap by smoothly asserting that there would naturally be strict performance standards firmly embedded within the federal program. Shapiro immediately snapped back, asking plainly if they can be fired, prompting AOC to cautiously state that the massive program would inherently include systemic mechanisms for addressing such issues. Refusing to let her off the hook, Shapiro demanded a simple yes or no, asking point blank if a person currently employed within a government-guaranteed job can actually be fired for producing bad performance. AOC's hands visibly gripped the sides of her wooden podium, the intense physical gripping acting as the outward physical manifestation of a cornered person desperately trying to hold a highly vulnerable position. It was not merely a physical stance, but a heavily strained intellectual one, her white knuckles clearly showing the immense pressure of attempting to force a single political sentence to somehow travel simultaneously in two completely opposite logical directions. She carefully stated that in extreme, isolated cases, there would theoretically be a formal process in place. Shapiro pounced instantly, logically deducing that if they can indeed be fired from the position, then the job is fundamentally not a guarantee. Conversely, if they truly cannot be fired under any circumstances, then she has actively created a perverse economic system where individual work performance absolutely does not matter. His vocal tone remained incredibly clean and remarkably fast, exhibiting the exact same terrifying precision as a brightly polished surgical scalpel, rapidly asking her which of the two stark realities it actually was. The flustered Congresswoman immediately accused him of maliciously creating a fundamentally false binary to trap her. Shapiro fiercely rejected the accusation, insisting firmly that he was simply identifying the strict logical binary that already inherently exists in reality. A true guarantee strictly means you literally cannot lose it, whereas a legitimate job explicitly requires adequate performance, concluding forcefully that you mathematically and logically cannot possess both simultaneously. He sternly reminded her that this observation was absolutely not a subjective political opinion, but rather fundamental, unyielding logic. He then ruthlessly moved on to his next line of attack before she could even formulate a proper response, and that abrupt, aggressive moving on was entirely its own unique kind of devastating answer. It was the definitive action of a supremely confident man who firmly considers the intellectual point permanently settled and harbors absolutely no intention whatsoever of letting his flailing opponent even attempt to relitigate the finished exchange. Shifting gears entirely, Shapiro noted that she proudly identifies herself politically as a democratic socialist, which she quickly confirmed by saying, "I do," and then he simply challenged her to name a single socialist country anywhere on the globe that has ever successfully implemented the radical economic policies she was currently proposing. AOC immediately cited the Scandinavian countries, specifically listing Denmark, Sweden, and Norway as shining examples that have successfully demonstrated the viability of her exact policies. Shapiro instantly detonated her premise, casually revealing that Denmark's own prime minister had recently stated publicly, and he emphasized that he was quoting the man directly, "Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy," further noting that the Danish PM had literally pleaded with foreign observers to please stop inaccurately referring to Denmark as a socialist nation. He then methodically dismantled her second example, pointing out that Sweden actually completely lacks a federally mandated minimum wage, possesses absolutely zero inheritance tax, and actively operates a massive universal school voucher program that is so robust, it would essentially make the legendary free market economist Milton Friedman weep genuine tears of joy. He then deployed a second, incredibly rare Shapiro pause, specifically executing it for maximum dramatic timing, before mockingly summarizing that she was deliberately attempting to use highly capitalist countries that actively and publicly reject the socialist label to somehow justify implementing her own explicitly socialist political platform, comparing the absurd logic to foolishly citing a strict vegetarian in order to successfully sell hamburgers. Watching intensely in the Bronx, Dorothy swiftly wrote down on her paper, "Denmark equals not socialist," PM said. She then looked back over at AOC's barren column and deliberately added a second highly visible question mark to the growing collection. There were now officially 3 total blanks residing permanently in the specific column belonging to the very woman who was supposed to politically represent the exact district where Dorothy had actively been diligently teaching innocent children how to properly solve for the variable x, since long before that very same Congresswoman was even born. I genuinely want to do something somewhat different here, Shapiro calmly announced, outlining his next maneuver by stating that he was firmly going to ask the Congresswoman 3 highly specific financial questions, and he would very much appreciate it if she would kindly answer each individual one completely before he offered any personal response. First, he asked if she fundamentally believed that the wealthy elite should absolutely pay their fair share in total national taxes, to which she enthusiastically replied, absolutely. Second, he asked exactly what specific income tax rate actively levied on all earnings exceeding the $10 million threshold she would personally consider to be factually fair. AOC quickly stated 70%, confidently noting that she had been very public regarding this exact stance. Third, he proposed a hypothetical scenario, asking that if the federal government aggressively taxed absolutely all private income sitting above that $10 million mark at an astonishing rate of 100%, essentially confiscating every single solitary dollar earned past that specific point, exactly how much total annual revenue would that drastic action actually generate for the government per year? AOC's mouth slightly opened and then quickly closed again. The incredibly brief gap of time occurring between those 2-minute physical movements spanned exactly a quarter of a single second, which happens to be the precise amount of processing time it mathematically takes for a panicked human brain to frantically search a mental reference shelf only to horrifyingly discover that it is completely empty. She stammered that the answer naturally depends on various factors, but Shapiro aggressively cut her off to offer uninvited help, ruthlessly citing official IRS data that clearly shows there is approximately $650 billion in total cumulative income recorded above the $10 million mark in any given year. He explained meticulously that if the government aggressively confiscated all of it at a rate of 100%, taking literally every single penny and heartlessly leaving those individuals with absolutely nothing left over, the federal government would effectively generate exactly $650 billion in total new revenue. He dramatically held up a single index finger to visually anchor his point, reminding her that her own prized Green New Deal, solely according to the official internal estimates actively provided by her own political party, costs literally anywhere between $500 billion and $1 trillion per year. He then deliberately held up a second stiff finger, reminding her that she had quite literally just told him mere seconds ago that a 70% tax rate was her definition of fair, before effortlessly doing the basic math for her. 70% of $650 billion actively equals exactly $455 billion. He purposefully let that incredibly specific numerical figure heavily land upon the silent room, $455 billion. He brutally pointed out that this amount absolutely does not even come close to covering the most aggressively low estimate of the program's massive annual cost. He systematically concluded that even if the government radically took every single solitary dollar from every single wealthy person actively making more than $10 million, completely confiscated absolutely everything they possessed, and left them with a bank balance of absolute zero, it still mathematically does not fully pay for her massive proposed program. Placing both of his hands firmly down onto the edges of his podium, he leaned in and stated, "So I ask you directly, Congresswoman, and I genuinely mean this as a fully legitimate question and absolutely not a rhetorical one at all, exactly who pays the rest of the bill?" In the Bronx, Dorothy's pencil was moving furiously across the paper as she independently calculated. $650 billion aggressively multiplied by 70% equals exactly $455 billion. The government ultimately needs between $500 billion and $1 trillion per year, resulting in a staggering federal deficit of at least $45 billion minimum. She stopped and simply stared at the bleak number she had just written down. And then she slowly looked upward, gazing vacantly at her apartment ceiling, no longer actively watching the television screen, assuming the specific distant posture of a deeply concerned person who is intensely thinking about something significantly larger and more important than the glowing screen situated right in front of them. What she was truly thinking about in that quiet moment was not the abstract political concept of the Green New Deal itself. Rather, her mind was firmly fixed upon Marcus, the inquisitive seventh grader who had innocently asked what the massive policy actually costs. And her thoughts expanded to include Marcus and the 28 other vulnerable kids currently sitting in her math class, and the 400 total kids actively enrolled in her entire public school, and ultimately the millions upon millions of unsuspecting kids scattered throughout every single school in this vast country who would eventually grow up, enter the challenging workforce, tear open their hard-earned paychecks, and shockingly discover that a massive portion of every single dollar they had ever bled for was being instantly confiscated by the government to blindly pay for something that the very same influential woman who had initially proposed it couldn't even manage to put a basic number on. Overcome by a profound sense of disappointment, she gently put her sharpened pencil down on the table. She resolutely did not write anything else, feeling deep in her bones that the paper had already clearly said absolutely enough. Driven into a corner on live television, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez desperately attempted to construct a real-time defense, frantically claiming that unprecedented economic growth would somehow magically generate the revenue needed to cover the Green New Deal's massive shortfall, a chaotic pivot that Ben Shapiro slowly and mercilessly dismantled, repeating the word growth with the heavy, condescending exhaustion of a veteran math teacher grading a wildly incorrect exam. Shapiro mocked her reliance on unspecified expansion to cure an astronomical federal deficit, deploying a devastating, calculated pause before softly but brutally diagnosing her stance not as standard economics, but as pure, unadulterated faith, a faith he sternly noted belongs exclusively inside a synagogue, not within the rigid columns of a federal budget. Without a binder or a backing committee, Shapiro leaned entirely on his rhetorical scalpel, ruthlessly tallying the evening's three most crucial, glaringly unanswered questions: the total cost of the legislation, the identity of the taxpayer when a 100% wealth confiscation mathematically falls short, and the basic functionality of a guaranteed jobs program where employees cannot be fired. He counted three devastating blanks, forcefully lecturing the paralyzed Congresswoman that any honest seventh grade math teacher in the Bronx would instantly fail her proposal because demanding hard numbers is exactly what responsible adults do before spending working class money. Frozen at the podium under the blinding studio lights and the unforgiving gaze of over 4 million viewers, AOC realized with terrifying clarity that offering any unverified number to a man whose brain operated like a high-speed calculator was akin to handing live ammunition to a sniper. Thus, paralyzed by a severe lack of data, she opted for a suffocating silence, ultimately retreating to a hollow 7-word slogan in the future we are actively building that landed like a cheap promotional poster where a rigorously engineered blueprint was desperately required. Before midnight, that exact 60-second exchange exploded across the internet, racking up 30 million views and earning the universal moniker The Math, while deep backstage, AOC's shell-shocked communications advisor violently slammed her laptop shut as the broadcast monitor endlessly looped the brutal silence that had just dismantled their flagship policy. Within hours, progressive organizations rushed out defensive statements that entirely lacked concrete cost estimates, a glaring omission swiftly exposed by a savvy Washington Post reporter inadvertently confirming Shapiro's core thesis without him even being in the room. Miles away in a quiet Bronx living room, veteran educator Dorothy Chen decisively turned off her television, folded her heavily annotated paper contrasting Shapiro's hard data with AOC's empty blanks, and prepared to teach her inquisitive seventh grader, Marcus, the most vital lesson of all. If a politician cannot physically show you the math simply does not work. Meanwhile, completely isolated in her upscale Washington apartment, a defeated AOC stared blankly at a crumpled napkin bearing her own private, frantic calculations, horrifyingly realizing that the exact $455 billion shortfall Dorothy Chen had just calculated was entirely accurate, and that even total wealth confiscation could not save her signature legislation. Unaware of these parallel revelations, Ben Shapiro sat quietly backstage with a bottle of water, reflecting not with celebration, but with surgical precision on the devastating half-second of silence he had hunted all evening, the undeniable sound of a politician realizing her unpriced framework truly amounted to zero. As the unprecedented fallout from this televised slaughter begins to engulf the nation's fragile political landscape, and millions of terrified voters desperately wait to see how a shattered progressive movement can possibly survive this self-inflicted catastrophe, one chilling question remains dangerously unresolved in the rapidly darkening halls of Congress, leaving everyone wondering exactly what drastic measures will be taken next.